that lovely introduction. I appreciate that. I particularly liked your good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to symbolize the various countries where our colleagues and participants are from. Thank you all for joining us, and a special hello to many of the names and people I recognize. As Fernando said, what I'd like to do today is review the incentives that have been adopted by regulators to attract clean energy projects. Before we get into the details, I think it's always important to stop and say, why is this important? Why do we care? And remember, our topic today is not why are renewable projects important? Why is renewable energy important? Instead, the issue is, why are incentives important? You'll see on the slide I've just clicked to a statement from the European Commission. To me, though lengthy, sums it up very well. Incentives are still required for renewable energy due to market imperfections, the fact that, frankly, every other form of energy receives some form of subsidy. There are barriers to entry, regulatory barriers, and the kind of assistance needed to support newer forms of technology, whether it's energy, telephony, or something else. Put more broadly, I thought the attached chart was pretty interesting, not because it's especially readable in the little blocks, but because it shows a couple of things. One, global investment in renewable energy across literally every region of the world. And second, as you will see, a kind of a lumpy rollout of renewable energy in most regions. It's not a smooth curve. It's a jagged curve. And as we will see, some of this jaggedness is probably due to changing regulatory structures and a changing market environment. What I'd like to do today with you all is review the key incentives utilized to encourage renewable development in various countries. Fernando mentioned some of the ones we'll focus on. And I think as we discuss these, I hope all of you as regulators and as energy experts will put a discussion framework around it for yourselves. Which incentives work best to achieve the policymakers' desired outcomes, whether by type of energy, amount, location, timing, and we probably should add pricing also. I hope by the end of the session we have a better sense of what's worked, what hasn't, and most importantly, what can we learn, because it is a process that is undergoing evolution and change on a continuous basis. This slide, entitled Principal Incentive Mechanisms, attempts to capture in a very truncated way the leading forms of incentives for renewable energy globally. This list is not exhaustive. I hope and believe that most of these terms are familiar to you. Feedin tariffs, renewable portfolio standards, which is really a first cousin or a sibling of tradable certificates, various fiscal incentives such as tax guarantees, tax credits, loan guarantees by public agencies, priority dispatch and priority access to the grid, net metering with small projects, very popular, competitive tenders, a growing source of accessing and promoting renewable energy, contracts for differences, which is a UK model that may be adopted elsewhere. And at the bottom, I said all of the above. Why did I say that? As we go through this little review, I believe we'll find that many countries, many jurisdictions might start with one program, such as a feed-in tariff, but then adopt other programs in parallel with a primary program to achieve the desired results. Skipping to the end for a second, if there's one lesson to be learned, it's that one size doesn't fit all. Each of you as a regulator will need to experiment with multiple devices to achieve your desired deployment of renewable. Probably most of us are familiar with feed-in tariffs. It is a mechanism to establish or fix the price for electricity generated by renewable facilities and provided to the grid. It's usually based on an assumed or estimated cost of renewable generation, including a return on capital deployed. Probably it is the most widely used tool globally, in part because it is so simple. The generator gets a price of X euro cents or dollar cents or English pence or whatever the local currency is per kWh delivered from a renewable facility. That's it. Sometimes it's differentiated by type or size, sometimes a single rate for all. But as we will see, there are mixed results because it is not a flexible system and doesn't account for changing technologies and costs. The UK commenced the FIT process in 2010 and initially applied the FIT, as is common in other jurisdictions, only to small-scale renewable energy projects. The result was insufficient deployment of renewable energy to attract the amounts of non-carbon generation the UK needed to achieve its carbon footprint reduction targets. Currently, it is creating what's called a contract for differences, or a long-term contract, which it hopes will spur additional investment in renewable energy. Basically, under the contract, there is contract stability by a long term, an agreement on a strike price for the output. The power is actually sold into the grid at market prices, and if the market price is less than the agreed contract price or strike price, the generator receives a supplemental payment from the government. The contrary is also true. If market rises above the strike price, the generator has to pay that surplus back. As you can see, the mechanism's goal is to produce long-term revenue stability to help finance projects. Germany also has a long experience with feed-in tariffs, over 20 years. It is generally recognized as a global leader in renewable energy support and development. What I'd like you to focus on this slide is not just that the FITs have been key to success, but that Germany has done a couple of other things. It's reset the FIT periodically over time to reflect changing and declining costs as wind, solar, and other renewables attain utility scale. And note that it has had an important supplement in the deployment, public financing, either loan guarantees or other credit support, kind of analogous to the U.S. experience with tax credits, to supplement the price for power sold, recognizing again that renewables need additional support other than simple market-based rates, especially in Germany, where we have a coal and gas-based system with declining energy prices today due to declining coal prices. Turkey is a very interesting case. Of course, it's a large dynamic economy. Until very recently, it had a growth rate that was either number 1 or number 2 in the world, heavily dependent on coal, and in 2010 took an aggressive approach toward feed-in tariffs. It developed a more comprehensive renewable energy support mechanism in that law as opposed to the traditional feed-in tariff that it had had previously for small-scale renewables. Note that Germany differentiates renewables by type and with different cents in U.S. cents per kilowatt hour. I know we have a number in our audience from Turkey, so I hope I'm not making any mistakes for you when I describe this creative and inventive system. A couple of other things of note. The incentive tariffs apply only for 10 years and only for plants that begin operation in December of next year. So there's some revenue certainty, but 10 years, not 20 years. 10 years is typically a little less than the debt term on these contracts, and subsequent FITs will be reset by the Cabinet of Ministers, therefore allowing flexibility. So Germany is trying an approach a little bit different from the contract for differences, but as a way of balancing needed flexibility with revenue predictability and certainty. Switching to the U.S., let's look at California. FITs were initially based not on the estimated cost of renewables, but on the cost of a new power plant driven by fossil fuels. California had a 20% renewable energies target for electricity generation. That initial FIT proved to be insufficient. California revamped its system, adopted an auction mechanism, long-term contracts, and tradable renewable credits, all of which combined have really jump-started California. It will exceed its 33% target before 2020. There is some talk of increasing that to 40%. I know we have a number of visitors today from Spain. Spain is a fascinating case study. When Spain introduced its FIT program on a large scale, projects were given a choice of FIT with a purchase obligation or market premium. It was very effective. In fact, too effective. There were massive oversubscriptions resulting in more deployment than was targeted and a large tariff deficit, such that 2 years ago Spain had to suspend incentives for new projects. In short, the FIT was set too high. It produced too much renewable energy that was too expensive, that's created a drag on the overall economy. This bar graph gives you a sense of the scope of the tariff deficit in euros, defined as the difference between the obligated payments under the FIT and the market price. It's a very expensive proposition for Spain. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned, I think, in all of these jurisdictions, U.S., California, et cetera, FITs alone are not sufficient to produce the desired level of generation. We need greater revenue stability and longer-term contracts, although there are a number of different ways contracts can be structured and formed. I think a point in the United Kingdom, too, that is worthy of note is this middle point. Prior to the changes recently announced, there was not sufficient clarity between different regulators and different regulatory roles. As we will see, regulatory clarity, predictability, and certainty are important. Germany, we just discussed, resetting rates and differentiating FIT by type has been successful. Spain, the 3,000 megawatt versus 400 megawatt says it all. The initial target was 400 megawatts of renewable by 2010. Spain already had 3,000 megawatts deployed by the end of 2006. So while some countries set a rate too low, California, UK, Spain set it too high. Another option is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a mechanism that mandates for each jurisdiction, a nation or in the United States a state, that a percentage of its electricity has to come from renewable energy, and then it's up to the market to decide how you do that. So the market-based solution tends to drive toward green certificates or renewable energy certificates, as they are called, or tradable certificates. The mechanism here, thus, is that the developer gets two streams of income, two different products that are sold. KWH, that frequently is sold into the market at market prices, plus the sale of the renewable credit or certificate that suppliers and utilities have to show and have to pay and have to buy. The UK experience is pretty interesting. They have what's called a renewable obligation. It's the same as the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And electricity suppliers are required to source an increasing proportion of their electricity from these sources. If they don't have sufficient certificates, they pay a penalty. What happens economically is that certificates take on a currency or a value. And here the regulator administers the program. So all you regulators take note. This is not Bitcoin. This is an actual valuable commodity. It has some complexity, as you can see by this graphic, which is one reason why the UK is moving toward the contract for differences. A certificate is yet another asset that has to be tracked, cataloged, can be subject to abuse, etc. This is why the UK is moving toward contracts for differences, first in parallel, but then ultimately to succeed. The renewable offset credits, it's perceived to be a flexible, easier to administer system, and as we saw under FITs, it combines with a strike price for the credit to give sufficient financial stability to the developer. In the U.S., the RPS program has helped jumpstart California so that it will exceed its total, and again, it's been in combination with long-term contracts, auctions, and prices. In the U.S. in total, 29 states have renewable portfolio standards out of a total of 50. Massachusetts I'm pausing on only because it strengthened its targets and made it a statutory obligation that regulated utilities have these certificates and meet this portfolio. Lesson here is you need to have regulatory teeth, enforceability behind your mandates, or it won't work. This gives you a sense of deployment in the U.S. I think the U.S. is sometimes thought of as lagging Europe on its embrace of renewables, but I would submit that that's not entirely true. In California, we had lack of clear responsibilities between agencies initially, just as the UK, weak enforcement. Those were fixed. We have stronger enforcement, clearer agency, just as I noted in the UK. In Massachusetts, there was uncertainty of revenue. There was a perception of regulatory risk because the legislatures might repeal the program. There were not long-term contracts. Massachusetts solved that problem through a couple of legislative changes that I've noted here to have a formal requirement that utilities purchase renewable energy under long-term contracts to meet the standards. The result has been substantial success in both states. The lesson, you have to have enforceable requirements with regulatory certainty and long-term contracts. I think many of us talk about priority dispatch and priority access to the grid as one way, but only one way, of helping to incentivize renewable production. Usually, in my experience around the world, priority access, priority dispatch is combined with some other mechanism such as FIT. Mere priority access alone probably doesn't get the payment rate per kilowatt hour up to the level necessary to support most renewables in a market-based system. In fact, as I say here, it really has to be coupled with other mechanisms. Germany, Spain, Greece, U.S., Albania, many others allow priority dispatch and access. There is a change in law pending before the Saudi Arabian Council of Ministers to grant priority access, et cetera. But there's a tension here because, as we know, renewables are intermittent and variable. And priority access all the time could interfere with that if there are sufficient levels of renewable resources there. I say could, not necessarily won't, because many TSOs are doing a lot of research on how widespread deployment of renewables can actually solve intermittency problems. But nonetheless, we have a tension. The system operator has to assure safe, adequate, reliable, uninterrupted supply, but we have a society goal of promoting renewable energy, and one way we do it is through priority dispatch. So you as regulators will need to help strike that balance going forward, the two policy goals that may be in conflict. Oops, sorry, I went a little bit too fast. Another form that is very common in the U.S. and gaining some traction elsewhere is through the use of tax credits. The U.S. historically has favored tax credits or tax incentives to jumpstart many socially desirable goals, not just renewable energy, but in a whole array of economic activity. So put in that broader context, it's not unusual to see the U.S. at a national level to say, let's not have feed-in tariffs, let's not have guaranteed prices, let's use tax credits. We have a couple dominant ones, an investment tax credit, which basically says for every dollar you invest in a renewable plant when it comes online, you get a 30% credit back, or a production tax credit. You don't get the credit when you enter service, you get the credit when you sell the kilowatt hours and put it online, and then you get the credit back over a 10-year period for each kilowatt hour you sold. In each case, it is a supplemental payment beyond the electricity price. It is monetizable and therefore adds to the financing. Plus, there are other tax benefits as well, including accelerated depreciation, tax-exempt financing. There's a debate about tax credits in the nations that offer them. Proponents think that upfront credits facilitate financing, which is always a problem for renewable projects. They're different. Lenders are a little bit skeptical. How do you solve that problem? and the proponents say that paying the tax credit up front places less risk on future contract performance. You don't have to worry about an FIT that might be changed politically. Proponents of Feedin tariffs say, gosh, you put the credit up front and the project fails for any reason, somebody's left holding the bag. Somebody's left holding that credit. The production tax credit was invented to kind of bridge those two factors by saying, okay, you can get the credit, but you get it over time, not up front, so that if the project fails, no one's stuck paying for it. The problem there is that the production credit alone may not be sufficient to finance a project that is otherwise based on market base. So tax mechanisms usually don't require compulsory prices to be paid by generators, to generators. That means you regulators don't need to set prices. It does establish price certainty up front. In the U.S. and in other countries, one problem is that these credits usually have a fixed period of time and then they expire. And that leads to a very disruptive pattern of development. If the project won't reach financial closing and commercial operation by the expiration of the credit, the developer doesn't go ahead, the pace of development of projects drops off. You get a very inconsistent pattern of development, and I think you saw that back earlier in my slide on the U.S. development with very spiky lines, and that's because of the lack of revenue stability. So whether it's a tax credit, feed-in tariff, long-term credit, long-term contract, or other credit or support mechanism, what we're seeing is developers need revenue stability over a reasonably long period of time. Because of some of the price overruns that people claim happens with feed-in tariffs or other fixed prices, a number of countries and jurisdictions have moved toward competitive tenders as a process to award long-term PPAs to qualified renewable projects. The tender differs fundamentally from the feed-in tariff in that instead of trying to estimate or guesstimate the target price for a particular renewable, the tender says, let's let the market respond. Usually the tenders are allocated by renewable so that you're not having renewables compete against fossil like natural gas or coal or even nuclear. It's a category of renewables, and sometimes it's even differentiated by technology, only solar, only wind, only geothermal. People are experimenting with tenders to allocate the tenders by geographical region or location to mitigate system impact, adverse effects, and it's proving to be a very flexible tool. But like any other tool, it has certain cautionary flags around it as well. If the price is too good, the project won't be built. If the price is too high, it leads to stranded costs and a lot of political pressure, as we'll see. Morocco is a very interesting case. It is a country that is heavily dependent on fossil fuels and is looking for a way to find out if it can jumpstart solar. One would think Morocco has massive solar, wind, and other renewables to lessen its dependence on fossils. It has set up a single buyer system because it recognizes that renewables will be more expensive than market, and that differential is not something it can place on its ratepayers. So it is elaborating a tender procedure with a special agency as the off-taker, with the government absorbing the difference between the bid price and the retail price. It's a really sophisticated project, and one of the reasons that I've highlighted it is that Mason, the government agency here, as you will see, has specifically targeted 5 sites that, for a variety of factors, including grid impact, it thinks are a good fit. The benefit of using the single off-taker is that you come up with a creditworthy counterparty in an emerging market, which is a premium that lenders place. Who's my creditworthy counterparty? It will increase financial stability and will lead to long-term projects, although too much of a good thing could lead to sovereign debt issues. Just as we've seen in other countries, too much renewable can lead to a tariff deficit in Spain. One country's tariff deficit could be another country's sovereign debt challenge. So we can see that there are many benefits with PPAs and some cautionary flags. Let me just focus on the middle bullet here. We've seen in Europe, in the EU, we've seen in the US, and we're seeing in other countries that even with a bid system, long-term fixed-price energy contracts that are persistently over market for a long period of time under enormous pressure on the regulator and sometimes on the government to rescind, revoke, or renegotiate. Consumers, businesses say, this is too expensive, we can't run our factories, our offices, we can't afford our light, we can't afford our heat. The politicians respond, and there's tremendous pressure to renegotiate the contracts, which is why some places are now moving towards staggered tenders. They go out for a certain amount for a certain period of time, and then in 3 years will go out for another amount, building kind of a ladder of it. I thought net metering might be interesting because it is a widespread and efficient way to help the small customer, typically the homeowner or a small shop, get paid for renewables promptly. And it's really not a cash payment, as I think many of you know. It's basically allowing the customer who puts a renewable on his or her building, solar PV is the most common, micro wind, and you sell the kWh you generate to the utility via a netting process. The kilowatt hours sold are netted against your kilowatt hours consumed, typically over a 12-month period. And if you have more that you've bought than you sold, you pay the difference. If you sold more than you bought, you usually get a credit at the energy-only rate for the surplus. But the actual offset is a dollar for dollar, cent per cent offset. So the credit includes transmission and distribution charges that are otherwise rolled into the kWh. Because it's very simple to administer and very, very clean and easy from the regulator standpoint, people love it. California has 120,000 customer accounts for net metering, and these are projects under a megawatt. Massachusetts has made net metering mandatory for utilities, and it's even expanded who can do it. You can put together a community group of up to 10 people in your neighborhood, combine as if you were one facility, and get the net metering. There's been widespread deployment in Massachusetts, California, opposite ends of our country. Massachusetts, a northern state like Germany, not necessarily thought of as a place with abundant sunshine, but the incentive program has worked well. 29 states in the U.S. have renewable portfolio standards. 42 have net metering, showing you how popular it has become for microgeneration. Net metering is widespread in Europe, in Greece, Spain, other countries, Africa. It's a very effective program. It's simple and certain for the customer. There are rarefied rate design issues here that on a one-off basis don't seem important. But if all of a sudden 120,000 customers have net metering, the issues can loom larger. One, it can cause a cost shift between customers who own distributed renewable generation to those who do not, because, as I pointed out, you're getting a fully bundled credit when all you're producing is energy. Thus, you're not necessarily displacing T&D. You, as the net metering customer, still have night and seasonal production demand. You have standby demand for inclement weather, snow, if your system fails, but you're getting a full credit and not really paying much for it. These are issues that I'm personally aware of regulators in many jurisdictions are coming to grapple with. The flip side, of course, is we're seeing that widely deployed microgrids with net metering can actually add to system stability and may actually cut the need to spend on T&D. Let me move into a discussion stage because I'm eager to respond to your questions and comments. As I alluded to at the beginning, can we say that one renewable incentive system is markedly superior to the others? I think the answer is no. No one size fits all. And that's true just as there's no one regulatory regime for any one country. There's no one size that fits all in one country that fits the others. We have very different technologies, and there are different and competing national goals and considerations for each jurisdiction. We can have either underperformance or overperformance from any mechanism in any system. To me, what we've learned over the last 20 years as renewable energy mechanisms have gained traction is that you, the regulators and policymakers who are on this call, need to be proactive. It's not as though you can set a rate in 2000 and dust off your hands and say, good, my work is done, we don't need to worry about it anymore. Governments and regulators need to analyze markets and desired targets. You need to set a target and then work backwards to decide what mechanisms have to be employed or should be employed to set the target. And you need to be responsible and flexible in responding to cost and price changes. Technology changes, prices drop, investment climates change. Your goal is not to set a price. Your goal is to come up with a policy that meets the investment climate and allows developers to proceed with the kind of project you want. So, you need to recalibrate incentives periodically, but prospectively, in advance. We've found, I think all of us who work in this field have found, that if you change prices retrospectively, it's very challenging to further development. Understandably, investors say, gosh, I built a unit that's worth 20 years of active life because you promised me I'd get 8 cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years. I'm 4 years into this, and now you're reducing the price on an investment I already made to 7 cents when you made a promise. Or even worse in some jurisdictions, we're lowering the price and we need money back. It's one thing to change and lower the price going forward. It's another to distort and disrupt legitimate investor expectations. You should periodically benchmark and change programs. Benchmark is a key word that we hear here, but I think you can't do it too frequently. Many of you are familiar with the children's fairy tale of Goldilocks, where she goes into the house of the 3 bears, and one pot of porridge is too hot, one is too cold, and one of them is just right, the one that's kind of in the middle. And you need to change your programs on a Goldilocks basis. Not too frequently, but not too much into the future, periodically. And tell the people that we review this periodically so they know. You, as regulators and policymakers, can come up with any number of incentives, and you can mix them and use them simultaneously, as we have seen in some of our successful examples. What are the fundamental things we need? Stable, predictable legal and regulatory environment. That's essential. Within that, we need to have well-defined and distinct roles for different regulators. Some regulators regulate price. Others are in charge of promoting renewable energy. Others have a different portfolio. And an investor gets very confused if 3 different government agencies tell him or her 3 different things at the same time. We need enforcement mechanisms. Those are important. Without enforcement, it doesn't happen. Different technologies probably require different mechanisms. Benchmark, evaluate, and provide long-term revenue stability. Not guarantees. If the project doesn't work, there's no guaranteed payment. If the project underperforms, there's no guaranteed payment. But there needs to be a reasonable opportunity to earn a stable, predictable revenue supply. A number of years ago, the World Bank did a survey globally with people involved in the energy generation business. And they said, what is it that you look for when you decide to invest in the energy sector in a country? Is it the rate of return? Is it the kilowatt hour? Is it the presence of an independent regulator? Is it the absence of an independent regulator? Is it tax incentives? Is it the ability to repatriate profits? What is it? And the bank board discussion paper, which I've cited here, came up with what I thought was a wonderful and very important finding. For global investors in energy, the overriding criterion is not any of those financial inducements, but a legal and regulatory framework that is fair, consistent, predictable, and where contracts and agreements are reasonably enforceable. Now that statement applied to all energy investment, not just renewable energy, but it applies, I think, even more for renewable energy, where the markets are still emerging for renewable energy, where the challenges and problems of intermittency and dispatch are being worked out even now with regulators and transmission system operators and other stakeholders. And particularly where, as here, a number of people in the audience are regulators, I think it's useful to go back and realize that you are essential in creating the framework to lead to your desired outcomes. With that, let me thank Fernando, Vicki Healy from NREL, the friends and folks at Leonardo Energy for sponsoring this. At the back are contacts for me so that if we can't answer questions, and by we I mean Fernando helping me out during this program, I would of course be delighted to have you email me and respond offline. Fernando, with that, I think I've hit my allotted time, and we have another 20 minutes or so for question and answer, so I'd be happy to engage, and I'd love to hear comments back from our audience. This is a terrific group of participants.
Okay, excellent, John. Thank you very much for this very nice presentation, very illustrative, and well, I think it's been perfect timing, just 39 minutes, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Excellent. So at this point, I would invite audience to submit your questions, please. So I see a few questions already in the list. So let me a few seconds to go through them, and I will be sending to the visible post. Okay, so we would have a first question. Okay, from Zev. In the RTS systems, we see momentarily certificates being purchased by suppliers, who are the sellers. Can private generators be entitled to certificates and sell to suppliers? Also, are RTS imposed on large consumers or only on suppliers? Thank you.
Thank you, Zev. That's a great question, and let me respond. I think that the answer is it depends on the jurisdiction and the system constructed, so that there's no reason why the obligation can't be placed on major customers as well as suppliers. In the state I chose from the U.S. to illustrate, Massachusetts, the obligation to either buy sufficient amounts of renewable energy or buy a certificate to show that you are supporting it was placed on the utility suppliers because they ultimately have the monopoly on distribution, and it was deemed to be an easily enforced way of assuring that the targets are being met or exceeded. There are other places, I think also in Europe and in the EU, where some countries look at major consumers, large industrial facilities, and say, you must meet a certain percent of your consumption because you're in the market, you're an eligible customer. I realize that's a dated phrase. And so you have to meet this target, 20%, 15%, 25%, or whatever it is, and you too can go into the market and buy these certificates to show either that you're buying the electricity or you're buying the offset. The generators are the ones who actually sell the certificates. If you build a renewable energy plant, a wind plant, you're selling kilowatt hours and you're selling certificates. Sometimes the buyer is one and the same party, but the two products are not bundled. So you can buy the electricity as party A, and then the generator can sell the certificate to party B. So there could be, for example, a market situation where somebody wants electricity, they like the generator and they like the product, but they have no need for the certificate. Someone else needs the certificate, and there's a market price that emerges for the certificate. Therefore, the generator gets two revenue streams, one for the certificate and one further. In many jurisdictions, there is a secondary market in the certificates, and you can imagine why. A party that is required to have a certain percent of renewables in its portfolio bought certificates because it couldn't achieve the kilowatt hours. It has found another source of supply. It has surplus certificates, and so it sells them to somebody else. One reason the certificate market is undergoing revaluation is, as you can imagine, it becomes difficult to track those certificates. How do you know which ones are legitimate, which ones have expired? Are the power plants that gave rise to the certificate still in production? I made a joke earlier about Bitcoin. This is not quite like Bitcoin, but I think regulators are realizing that a market-based solution based on certificates is a very interesting economic theory, but it has certain real-world limitations on implementation that people are trying to work their way around. Hopefully I answered that one.
Okay, good, thank you. So we have another question by Jacobo. In the low-income countries, can the tax systems effectively replace feed-in tariffs?
That's a very perceptive question. And before I answer it, let me make a reference also where people can get more information on this. The United States Association of Utility Regulators, called NARUC, the National Association of Regulated Utility Commissioners, and they're NARUC, NARUC.org, commissioned a report several years ago that looked at how renewable energy incentives can work in lower income countries. The theory was it shouldn't be a binary choice. I can have renewable energy, but only if I'm a high income country, and if you're a low income country, too bad, you have to deal with dirty fossil fuels. And the theory behind the report was obviously no. That is an inappropriate level of discrimination. You don't need to do that. NARUC's report, I think, is available on its website. It's a little bit dated now because it wrapped up, I think, in 2010 or 2011, but you should take a look at it. The question was, can the tax incentives effectively replace the FIT? In part. However, a tax incentive, including a tax credit, is useful only if you have other taxable income. So if you create let's take Morocco. If you create a special purpose entity in Morocco to build a renewable energy facility, and if the Morocco program included a generous tax benefit, that's great, but only if that entity throws off enough taxable income to be able to take advantage of it. I'm not an expert on Morocco tax laws, so there may be other ways to use that credit offshore. I just don't know. But as an historical example, this is a real problem in the United States in the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. So the credit became refundable. So you actually got cash back because businesses didn't have income. What I think is more common in low-income countries is if the FIT is going to be too high, to have a government-backed off-taker or a government-backed program, such as Morocco has, where the customer pays the regulated rate or the market rate, which maybe will move up gradually over time, but the difference between that and the price that has to be paid to the renewable generator to cover its costs is absorbed by a government entity. More that than tax.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question by Fausto. I wonder which is the incentive deficit globally? Hundreds of millions? Well, yeah, more than thousands actually. I suppose only for Spain it's some 20 to 30 billion euros. So how long is the way to grid parity and 0.8 considering your experience? Thank you.
I don't know what the tariff deficit is globally. That would be a very interesting research paper. There may be some data out there on it. I just am not familiar with it. Part of that depends on whether or not the jurisdiction actually calculates the tariff deficit, and even if it does, how does it calculate it? How do you know what you're comparing? But I think you're correct. If you, in the broader sense, if you are comparing globally the price of renewables to globally the price of non-renewable generation, probably collectively renewables are going to be higher by a considerable amount of money when you aggregate it, which would be one way of looking at the tariff deficit. As the European Commission noted in the quote I started with, though, there are all kinds of subsidies everywhere in every jurisdiction for all kinds of energy. So I think a true academic study would have to take into account not just a comparison of the renewable price versus the conventional or fossil price, but also the tax expenditures and other incentives and other guarantees that go into assuring a safe, reliable supply of oil or coal-fired generation or nuclear-fired generation. As an example, many jurisdictions have tax incentive schemes to promote drilling for new natural gas and new oil, with various depreciation incentives and depletion allowances to help encourage drillers to drill. So that's a form of subsidy, but because it's upstream, we don't tend to think of it as a subsidy to electricity. But when natural gas spins a blade and makes a kilowatt hour, it has been a benefit of a subsidy, no question. When coal rides in trucks on highways, taxpayer dollars paid for those highways. That's a subsidy. So I think it's a very good question, very tricky. To the other part of your question, are we approaching grid parity with renewables? We certainly are globally, and we are doing so in areas, not surprisingly, that have limited fossil fuel, limited interconnection, and a rising demand. Two areas that I'm most familiar with in the U.S., and then I'll switch overseas for a minute. Hawaii, which obviously is an island, solar and wind now are basically grid parity in Hawaii. And that's, of course, in part because all of their fossil fuel is imported, so you have transport costs and other costs like that. In California, Southern California, and the desert Southwest, pretty much the same case, but for different reasons. California is attached to the national pipeline network in the U.S., access to gas, access to coal, decent nuclear fleet, et cetera. But the massive deployment of renewables on a large utility scale and some transmission constraints from other areas has meant that the Southern California basin also is approaching grid parity. And in Europe, I think that in Germany, some of the wind facilities are approaching grid parity, although that was a year or two ago, and the persistent decline in coal prices have pushed down overall German electric rates, so that delta may have expanded a little bit. But we are seeing a combination of technology change, wide-scale deployment, and other factors that are pushing certain regions toward grid parity probably quicker than people imagined 4 or 5 years ago. That gives me great optimism, great hope.
Allow me to jump to one of my questions. As you're talking about grid parity, so at this point, no further economic support would be required. However, I think that other regulatory measures are still needed to support further penetration of these competitive renewables. Can you comment on this?
Sure.
Maybe priority dispatch, maybe also, well, addressing reluctancy of traditional utilities to, well, penetration of non-conventional generation, probably also addressing the balancing issues. Do you have any comment on this? Thank you.
Yes, and Fernando, I don't want to monopolize this discussion. If there are some observations or comments you'd like to make, I would welcome these. And if you'd like to set those out, please do so. Is there anything you'd like to add to the discussion?
No, just thinking on this, whether there are some regulatory recommendations beyond the economic support, whether there are other fields where regulators can also consider some measures.
Good. Yes, in my view, there are continual areas for regulatory thinking, review, and assessment. Even if, as you point out, on a per kWh basis, certain PV, certain wind is at parity and doesn't need the incentives or the level incentives, are there other areas of assistance? And I think the answer is yes. First, there is much to be done with the grid in terms of better modeling renewables, their likelihood on a micro basis, when the wind is going to spin the turbine and when the kilowatt hour is going to be delivered. There are great strides being made with that using massive data and massive computer modeling. This will, in fact, add to the benefits that renewables bring to a system. I think that there is a concern with traditional transmission system operators and utilities that renewables, once they reach a certain size as a percent of your system, create instability and add to costs. But there's a growing school of experience, thought, and examination that says, well, actually, to the contrary, once you have a sufficient level, they are actually adding tremendous value beyond their kilowatt hours in terms of distributing risk, reducing the need for further investment in transmission, and allowing distribution areas to maintain stability better than normal. As one example, the United States has learned, and other countries are learning through massive storms, the areas that come back first when there are widespread outages are those that have widespread deployment of small-scale renewables in certain geographical areas or locations. So I think that the regulatory community and the engineering and scientific community is on the cusp of a lot of important research that shows widespread renewable deployment can avoid lots of other system costs, thereby creating savings for ratepayers.
Okay, thank you very much, John. There are a few remaining questions, so let's maybe try to address them a bit quicker. So to well to receive everyone's
Sure.
everyone's comments. So next question by Abhinav. What's the ideal time frame we are indicating at when we say a long-term contract in RPAs, for instance?
Good. Abhinav, that's usually tied into the likely duration of long-term debt financing on the project, probably above 10 years, but not longer than 20. 15 to 20 years is probably the sweet spot. You probably don't need to go beyond 20.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me jump to another question coming from Isaac, who works in Africa. There are hardly incentives from government. So what are, in your opinion, the way forward for developing countries to increase access to renewable energy? I think we already commented a bit. If you have any additional comments, thank you.
Yeah, I would look to what Morocco is doing, not as a model, but as a kind of a philosophy. Poor countries in Africa, and I've had the privilege of working in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, pay a lot for energy because you are consuming significant amounts of hydrocarbons, coal, oil, diesel, kerosene, etc. So to me, what you as regulators need to do is tie development of renewables into displacing these other expensive fuel types so that the economic impact is either neutral or positive as opposed to looking like a rate shock. A diesel-fired power plant is very expensive. Diesel fuel is expensive and volatile. But many lower-income countries rely on diesel or fuel oil, which has security of supply issues and everything else. And so I think the equation should be, how can we use renewables to displace having to burn $120 a barrel oil?
Thank you, Jeff. Next question by Roman Dilser. Which RE markets do you see as most promising in the short and long term? Thank you.
Roman, if I really knew the answer to that question, I would become a hedge fund portfolio manager and not a mere lawyer. That said, I think that we are very fortunate right now. The geographic markets are almost consistent throughout the world, whether it's Asia, Mideast, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, North and South America. Saudi Arabia, as just but one example, is moving forward with a program that is targeting 54 gigawatts, 54 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2020 to displace oil and natural gas. And that's an opportunity that probably 10 years ago no one thinking about where to site a new renewable plant would have thought of Saudi Arabia. They would have said, they've got all the fossils they need. They don't care about this. Everybody is caring. Everybody's investing. So it would seem to me you go back to the legal and regulatory regime, stability, and an investment climate. In terms of, if by markets you mean in terms of types, I'm very interested to see what we're going to be doing with concentrated solar and, more importantly, tying or pairing an intermittent renewable plant such as wind or solar with some form of storage. Energy storage is going to be very big in all of this, and I would look at that.
Thank you. Next question by Zef. Is this regulation certificate in the hand of electricity regulator or with other regulatory bodies? Thank you.
Usually, the repository of the certificate is a government agency. It does not necessarily have to be the utility regulator. Sometimes there's an agency on environment and efficiency that becomes the repository. It depends on the jurisdiction.
Okay. What if you have a FE? I'm not sure. or
Yeah,
combination?
let me just try that. I think I get the question, which is, even if you have different kinds of incentives combined, and the project is still not financeable, what do you do? And that's a hard question to answer in the abstract, though it's a good question. And probably, if you actually have a long-term contract with a creditworthy counterparty at a reasonable price per kilowatt hour, some additional incentives like a contract for differences, price guarantee, or something like that, and you still count the project, it has to do with something else. It may be political risk in the jurisdiction. It may be the technology is perceived too risky. But it probably is, at that point, it's probably an external issue, not a failure of one of the incentives.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, to what extent do you think the current renewable energy investment incentives can influence the anticipated levelized electricity cost of fossil powered plants? As an example, is given for natural gas power plants that are running, nowadays less than 10 years ago plants. So if you can comment on this, thank you.
Yeah. Flo, you're absolutely right. I think we are actually seeing enormous pressure coming from both renewable energy investment, but also other kinds of generation, such as gas, on other costly plants. Almost a domino effect. There are multiple bankruptcies of coal-fired plants in the United States, bankruptcies, because they cannot compete economically in TSOs or grid systems with abundant renewable and abundant natural gas. They just cannot compete economically. It's not that there's an unfair advantage given to these other forms of generation. It's that they economically cannot compete. And gas sometimes gets backed down in Southern California when there's enough renewable energy coming into the system without any degradation of system stability. If I'm going to build a new combined cycle gas plant today in the world, in addition to the usual questions, my due diligence list would include things like how much renewable energy is there already there, how much is planned, what's the incentive, what if 120,000 customers do what Californians do and in the next 10 years all put solar PV on their roof and don't buy electricity anymore? I think this has a tremendous impact on the economic value of, the economic viability of, and the long-term planning for more conventional power plants. Certainly nuclear, for example. We all talk nuclear, or at least in the U.S. and the U.K., there's always talk about the nuclear renaissance, a new generation of low-cost nuclear plants. I am skeptical as to whether... Hello?
Yeah, hello, John.
Oh, sorry, my headset battery died. I'm skeptical as to whether there will be any new nuclear plant built in the U.S. in my lifetime because of the downward cost pressure from deployment of renewables.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. A big question. In case of Spain, what policy changes are necessary to solve tariff deficits? Well, for being in Spain, it's been a long debate, and if you have any magic formula, it would be very welcome. So rather than a solution, maybe some comments. Thank you, John.
Fernando, I'll let you and your colleagues come up with the answer to that. And of course, it goes to larger macroeconomic issues for the economy as a whole, ratepayer affordability, and so forth. Mm-hmm. The good news, though, is I think that by being an early leader, Spain has learned a lot. And once the utilities and the government figure out the solution to the current tariff deficit, I am confident that policymakers and regulators will be able to construct an appropriate system going forward. You only get better at something when you fail at it earlier. You become a better soccer player, when you keep falling all the time. You become a better skier when you keep falling all the time. And so I'm confident that at some point in the relatively near future, we'll see a new system in place that will build on global lessons learned, Spanish lessons learned.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, John. So a few remaining questions. Let's give, do you have 5 more minutes, John?
I would be happy to. Thank you.
Okay, and then we will probably end up by going through all the questions. Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions relative to technologies, so let me send them. First question by Abhinav. What would be an appropriate incentive mechanism in case of distributed generation for solar PV as technology, rooftop, in case you have not stable grid availability, power cuts? Thank you.
Now, that's a very interesting proposition, because in that circumstance, I think what you're positing is that you might not be able to deliver the rooftop PV generated power to the grid all the time because of lack of grid stability. On the other hand, if you're in a situation like that, would you be able to create regulated microgrids so that the rooftop PV could serve 3 or 4 households under some kind of commercial agreement where safety, technology, and fair pricing is somehow overseen by the regulator? That gives a greater incentive to the owner to install it, but it also helps solve the grid stability and grid availability issues that the questioner references. So I think there are creative solutions out there that you can come up with. You of course, would want to make sure if a homeowner is serving another homeowner that it's safe, and you want to make sure that the pricing is fair.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question, following up Fernando's comment, what is needed to promote marine energy? Thank you.
Angelo, I'm assuming by that you mean offshore energy technologies, such as, but not limited to, deep water offshore wind. And to me, this is an example of where just because some technologies, such as rooftop PV and land-based wind, may reach grid parity and the level of subsidy or support can be radically reduced or eliminated, there are other technologies that are still nascent, still in their initial stages, and they require R&D support, whether that's through a feed-in tariff, a long-term contract, or otherwise. There is, as I think you know, there's a global effort by various agencies, governments, research laboratories, universities, and private entrepreneurs to look at harnessing tidal power and ocean currents with submersible turbines. There are experiments dealing with those in the U.S., Canada, Norway, places that have deep water and big currents and big tides that are proximate to land so you can get the electricity ashore. A lot of wonderful R&D is going on there, but those will not be grid parity for a while. So I think you do need, it goes back to the earlier point, the regulators and policymakers need to look at specific technologies and figure out the appropriate level of support and how to achieve that level of support by technology.
Thank you, John. So last 2 questions. What sort of energy storage mechanism do you recommend? Will lithium batteries be ideal? Thank you.
Well, that's another question. If I really knew the answer, I would be sitting in an office in New York City moving lots of money around. There's a lot of competition, as you know, in both the types of storage technology and within the battery type, what type of battery. And I just don't have enough technical knowledge to predict that. I would think that all of us who are interested in this need to read the professional literature routinely because it's changing very, very rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And last question, rather comment. Don't you think that all this system is incredibly complex? And lawyers like complexity. Wouldn't the tax credit good and simple to apply for every kind of energy and allocation, dropping complexity? Thank you.
Okay. Fausto, sometime we'll have to meet for a beer and I'll explain to you how lawyers actually try to eliminate complexity on behalf of their clients. That was one of the premises behind a tax credit. It's simple, it's direct, and it avoids complexity, and it keeps the regulator out of it. But people always figure out different things, or things get more complicated over time. So in terms of tax credits, as we noted, the credit is only as good as the income you have to offset it against. No income, the credit is worthless. The credits are largely self-certifying unless it's a production tax credit. That can be fraud. The taxpayers pay the credit up front. You place the $100 million plant in service in the U.S. and you get a $30 million check from the government the next month. The taxpayers have paid for that. But if the plant blows up and fails a year into its 20-year contract, someone has lost a lot of money, and that someone is the taxpayers. So it doesn't, the credit doesn't match the benefit to the developer with the timeline of the benefit to the consumer. I like simplicity. I like markets. I like the idea of having a tender process, and then limit it by type, size, location, and the number of megawatts you want, and then in 3-4 years, rebid again and rebid again to keep testing the market. I think that's about the simplest way to do it. I think it's very hard, for example, to say, what price does a hydrokinetic facility really need based off the coast of Norway to succeed? I think very few of us know how to set that price. But if you said the EU is setting up a competitive tender for hydrokinetic facilities to contract in total 500 megawatts from at least 3 different offshore locations for a 25-year contract, you might get some very interesting results. And I would hope non-complex.
Okay, so thank you very much to our audience for having joined today. Thank you for your interest. So we have spent as much time for questions as for the presentation. So this is definitely great signal. And also great signal for you, John, for your interesting presentation and raising topics that definitely are of interest for our audience. John, I will give you the floor now to close the session. Thank you very much.
Well, Fernando, my thanks to you and Vicki Healy and to everyone who attended and everyone who asked questions. This has just been a great pleasure for me. Wonderful questions that were fascinating for me and fun for me to try to respond to. You have my contacts. Don't hesitate to email me to follow up. Thank you again, Fernando, for all your work in hosting this and setting it up and coaching me through it. I hope everybody has a wonderful remaining part of the day. Thank you all.